The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine stood before her ornate mirror, watching her reflection with a mixture of sadness and resignation. The woman staring back at her looked every inch the princess she had become, but Catherine could barely recognize the free-spirited girl who once ran barefoot through the gardens of her family home in Berkshire. That girl seemed like a distant memory now, buried beneath layers of protocol, tradition, and expectations that grew heavier with each passing day. It had been 15 years since she first stepped into the royal spotlight as Prince William's girlfriend, and 7 years since their fairy tale wedding had captivated the world. But fairy tales, Catherine had learned, were far more complicated in real life than in the storybooks she used to read to her children. The palace walls that once seemed like a protective embrace now felt more like elegant prison bars, and the rules that governed her every move had multiplied exponentially since she first said, "I do" in Westminster Abbey. Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Margaret, entered the room quietly, carrying a thick folder that Catherine had come to dread seeing. It contained the latest updates to the Royal Protocol Handbook, a document that seemed to grow thicker each month as new restrictions were added to her already constrained life. Margaret's expression was sympathetic as she placed the folder on Catherine's dressing table, knowing all too well how these updates affected her mistress. "Your Royal Highness, there are several new guidelines that require your immediate attention," Margaret said softly, her voice tinged with the same sadness that Catherine felt. Margaret had been with her for 3 years now, long enough to witness firsthand how the invisible chains of royalty had slowly tightened around Catherine's life. Catherine picked up the folder with trembling hands, her heart already sinking as she imagined what new freedoms were about to be stripped away. She had once been told that with great privilege came great responsibility, but no one had warned her that it also came with the gradual erasure of everything that had made her who she was. The spontaneous woman who once surprised William with impromptu trips and adventures was now required to submit detailed itineraries for approval weeks in advance for even the simplest outings. As she opened the folder, Catherine's eyes immediately fell upon the first new restriction, and her breath caught in her throat. Effective immediately, she was no longer permitted to engage in any form of social media, even through official palace accounts, without pre-approval from a committee of senior advisors. The decision had been made, the document explained, due to concerns about the immediate and unfiltered nature of social media communication in an increasingly sensitive political climate. Catherine's mind flashed back to just last week, when she had wanted to share a simple message of support for a children's charity that was close to her heart. The post had taken 3 days to get approved, and by then, the moment had passed, the charity event was over, and her heartfelt words felt hollow and meaningless. She remembered the excitement she once felt when she could connect directly with people who supported the causes she cared about, how genuine and authentic those interactions had felt. Now, every word was scrutinized, sanitized, and stripped of the personality that had once made her social media presence so refreshing and relatable. The second restriction hit even closer to home. Catherine was no longer allowed to attend private social gatherings with friends who were not on an approved list vetted by palace security and protocol officers. The list, she discovered with growing horror, contained fewer than a dozen names, most of whom were other royal family members or long-standing family friends who had been thoroughly investigated and deemed appropriate company for a future queen. Her best friend from university, Sarah, who had been her maid of honor and had stood by her through every challenge of royal life, was notably absent from the list. Sarah's crime? She had recently started dating a journalist, and the palace deemed this an unacceptable security risk. Catherine's heart broke as she realized she would have to cancel their monthly coffee dates, those precious few hours when she could laugh freely, gossip about nothing important, and remember what it felt like to be just Catherine instead of Her Royal Highness. The restrictions continued, each one more painful than the last. Catherine was no longer permitted to drive herself anywhere without a security detail, even for short trips to the local shops or to pick up her children from school. She remembered the simple joy she once found in driving alone, windows down, music playing, feeling like any other mother running errands. Those moments of normalcy had been some of her most treasured, brief escapes from the fishbowl existence that royal life demanded. Even her clothing choices were now subject to new levels of scrutiny. A detailed dress code had been established that went far beyond the general guidelines she had followed before. Every outfit required approval from a style committee, ensuring that her choices aligned with current political sensitivities, cultural considerations, and diplomatic implications. The days when she could throw on a favorite dress because it made her feel confident and beautiful were gone, replaced by strategic wardrobe decisions that sent carefully calculated messages to the world. Catherine closed the folder and walked to her window, gazing out at the London skyline that stretched beyond the palace grounds. Somewhere out there, women her age were making spontaneous plans with friends, posting unfiltered thoughts on social media, choosing their own clothes, and driving themselves to the grocery store. These simple freedoms seemed as foreign to her now as flying to the moon. She thought about the conversation she had had with William just last night, when she had tried to express her growing feelings of suffocation and isolation. He had listened with the patience and understanding that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago, but his hands were tied. "I know it's difficult, darling," he had said, holding her close as she fought back tears. "But these rules exist to protect us, to protect our children, and to protect the monarchy itself. We have to trust that those who make these decisions understand threats and risks that we cannot see." But Catherine wondered if those making the decisions understood the human cost of their protective measures. Did they know that she sometimes stood in her bathroom at 3 a.m., staring at herself in the mirror and wondering if the real Catherine Middleton had disappeared forever? Did they understand that the woman the world saw as having everything she could ever want sometimes felt like she had lost everything that truly mattered? The irony was not lost on her that she had married into a family known for their dedication to service. Yet she felt increasingly unable to serve in the authentic, meaningful way she had once envisioned. Every charitable endeavor was now filtered through multiple committees, every public appearance choreographed to the smallest detail, every word she spoke in public carefully scripted and approved. The genuine passion she felt for her causes was being slowly suffocated by the very system meant to amplify her ability to help others. Margaret returned to the room, bringing Catherine's schedule for the day. Even this simple document illustrated how far removed her life had become from anything resembling normalcy. Every 15-minute block was accounted for, from her morning briefing to her evening appearance at a state dinner. There was no room for spontaneity, no allowance for the unexpected, no space for Catherine to simply be human. As she prepared for her first appointment of the day, a meeting with representatives from one of her patronages, Catherine caught herself practicing her smile in the mirror. Not because she wasn't genuinely happy to support the cause, but because even her facial expressions had become performative, calculated to convey the right message at the right time. She wondered what had happened to the natural, radiant smile that had first captured William's heart at university, the one that came from pure joy rather than royal duty. The weight of the new restrictions settled over her like a heavy cloak as she made her way through the palace corridors. Each step echoed with the sound of another piece of her former self being left behind, another freedom sacrificed on the altar of royal obligation. Catherine knew that millions of people around the world would struggle to understand her pain, given the privilege and luxury that surrounded her daily life. But privilege, she had learned, could be its own kind of prison, especially when it came at the cost of the very things that made life worth living. As her car pulled away from Kensington Palace, Catherine pressed her hand against the bulletproof window and watched ordinary people walking freely down the street, talking on their phones, laughing with friends, living lives filled with the beautiful unpredictability that had been systematically removed from her own existence. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what that kind of freedom felt like, knowing that with each new rule, each additional restriction, That memory grew a little more distant, a little more like something that had happened to someone else entirely. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the private drawing room, where Catherine sat with her mother, Carol Middleton, for what had become an increasingly rare private visit. The new protocols made even these intimate family moments feel formal and constrained, with security personnel positioned just outside the door and every conversation carefully monitored for duration and content. Catherine watched her mother's concerned expression as she shared the latest developments in her restricted royal life, seeing her own pain reflected in the eyes of the woman who had raised her to be independent and strong. Carol reached across the ornate coffee table to squeeze her daughter's hand, a gesture that felt both comforting and heartbreaking. I hardly recognized the girl who used to climb trees in our backyard and dream of traveling the world, Carol said quietly, her voice heavy with maternal worry. The comment hit Catherine like a physical blow, because it perfectly captured the transformation she could feel happening to herself but had been unable to articulate. The new restrictions had continued to arrive with clockwork regularity over the past few months, each one chipping away at another piece of Catherine's autonomy. Just that morning, she had received notice that she was no longer permitted to participate in any physical activities that carried even minimal risk of injury. This meant the end of her beloved skiing trips, her weekend horseback rides, and even the casual tennis matches she had enjoyed with friends. The palace's explanation was straightforward. Any injury to a senior royal required immediate medical disclosure and could cause unnecessary public concern or speculation about her health. Catherine's mind wandered to the last skiing trip she had taken with William and the children just 6 months ago. She could still feel the exhilaration of racing down the pristine slopes, the cold mountain air stinging her cheeks, and the pure joy of physical freedom that came with the sport. She had been an accomplished skier since childhood, and the annual family ski trips had become one of her few remaining connections to the adventurous girl she used to be. Now, even that escape was forbidden, deemed too risky for someone whose public image required her to appear perpetually composed and uninjured. The irony was particularly cruel, given that her children were still encouraged to participate in sports and outdoor activities as part of their normal upbringing. She would now be relegated to watching from the sidelines as George, Charlotte, and Louis learned to ski, unable to share in their discoveries and achievements in the same hands-on way she had once imagined. Catherine wondered how she would explain to them why Mummy could no longer join in their adventures, how she could encourage them to be brave and try new things while she herself was being systematically prevented from doing the same. Perhaps even more devastating was the news that she was no longer permitted to travel abroad for personal reasons without it being classified as an official state visit. This meant that the spontaneous weekend trips she and William had occasionally managed to take to visit friends in other countries were now impossible. Every foreign journey would require months of advanced planning, diplomatic coordination, and official protocols that turned what should be relaxing breaks into carefully orchestrated public events. Catherine thought about their trip to Scotland the previous year, when they had managed to slip away to a friend's cottage in the Highlands for just 3 days. It had been their first genuine vacation in months, free from official engagements and public scrutiny. They had cooked their own meals, gone for long walks without security hovering nearby, and slept in until noon without worrying about disappointing anyone. Those 3 days had felt like a lifeline, a reminder of who they were beneath the royal titles and expectations. Now, even domestic travel required extensive advance notice and security arrangements. Catherine had been forced to cancel a planned surprise visit to her sister Pippa's home just last week because the 48-hour notice she had given was deemed insufficient for proper security protocols. The spontaneous family gatherings that had once been such an important part of her emotional well-being were becoming increasingly impossible to arrange. The restrictions extended into the most intimate aspects of her daily life as well. Catherine was no longer permitted to answer her own phone calls, even from family members. All communication now had to be filtered through her private secretary, who would determine whether the call was appropriate and schedule it for an approved time. The easy, flowing conversation she used to have with her siblings and close friends had been replaced by formal, scheduled calls that felt more like business meetings than personal connections. Her brother James had tried to call her directly just the day before, wanting to share the news that his wife was pregnant with their second child. Instead of hearing the excitement in his voice and being able to share in that immediate joy, Catherine had to wait for her secretary to relay the message and then schedule a formal call for later that afternoon. By the time she was able to speak with James, the spontaneous happiness of the moment had been lost, replaced by a stilted conversation that felt forced and artificial. Even her relationship with her own children was being affected by the increasing restrictions. Catherine was no longer allowed to take them on impromptu outings or change their schedules without extensive consultation with their security detail, their tutors, and the palace protocol office. The simple pleasure of deciding on a beautiful day to take the children to the park or for ice cream had been replaced by rigid schedules that had to be planned and approved days in advance. She remembered a recent afternoon when Charlotte had come to her with tears in her eyes, upset about something that had happened at school. Catherine's instinct was to take her daughter for a walk in the gardens, just the two of them, where they could talk privately and Charlotte could feel safe to express her emotions. Instead, she had to request permission from security, wait for a safety assessment of the garden route, and have two protection officers trail them at a discreet distance. The natural, nurturing moment she had wanted to share with her daughter had been transformed into yet another official procedure. The dress code restrictions had also intensified beyond anything Catherine could have imagined. She was now required to submit detailed photographs and descriptions of her intended outfits for approval, not just for official events, but for any public appearance, including casual outings with her children. A color coding system had been implemented that designated which colors she could wear to which types of events, ensuring that her clothing choices aligned with diplomatic sensitivities and political implications she was rarely fully briefed on. Catherine's personal style, which had once been praised for its accessibility and relatability, was being systematically replaced by a uniform-like wardrobe of approved designers and carefully calculated fashion statements. The joy she had once found in selecting clothes that made her feel confident and beautiful had been replaced by a complex matrix of considerations that had nothing to do with her personal preferences or comfort. Even her choices about her children's clothing were now subject to scrutiny. George's school uniform had to be approved to ensure it sent appropriate messages about the royal family's relationship with education and privilege. Charlotte's hair accessories were selected based on their cultural appropriateness and potential symbolic interpretations. Lewis's casual play clothes were chosen to project the right balance of normalcy and refinement. The simple pleasure of dressing her children in clothes she thought were cute or comfortable had become another calculated public relations exercise. The cumulative effect of these restrictions was beginning to take a visible toll on Catherine's spirit. William had noticed that she spent more time staring out windows with a distant expression, and her naturally warm personality seemed to be retreating behind an increasingly professional facade. The woman who had once filled rooms with genuine laughter and spontaneous conversation was becoming more guarded, more careful, more isolated from the very human connections that had always sustained her. During her conversation with her mother that afternoon, Catherine finally voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart for months. "I'm afraid I'm disappearing, Mom," she said quietly, tears finally beginning to fall. "Every day there's a little less of me and a little more of this royal persona that I'm supposed to become. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that losing myself piece by piece is worth it, even for the good work we're supposed to be doing." Carol's own eyes filled with tears as she listened to her daughter's pain. She had raised Catherine to be strong, independent, and true to herself, but she was watching helplessly as those very qualities were being systematically suppressed in service of an institution that seemed to value conformity over authenticity. The vibrant young woman who had captured a prince's heart was slowly being transformed into a carefully controlled public figure whose every human impulse was subject to committee approval. As their visit came to an end, Catherine realized that even this conversation with her mother would likely be noted in some report, categorized, and filed away as part of her official record. The privacy she had once taken for granted in her most intimate relationships was now just another luxury that had been deemed incompatible with her royal duties. She hugged her mother goodbye, knowing that it might be weeks before the schedules and protocols would allow for another such visit, and wondering how many more pieces of herself she would lose before they met again. The grandfather clock in the corner of Catherine's private study chimed midnight as she sat alone, surrounded by the latest batch of protocol amendments that had arrived that evening. The palace seemed eerily quiet at this hour, but Catherine had found that these late-night moments were the only time she could truly be alone with her thoughts, free from the constant presence of staff, security, and the watchful eyes of those whose job it was to ensure she never stepped outside the increasingly narrow lines of acceptable royal behavior. The newest restrictions were perhaps the most personal and painful yet. Catherine was no longer permitted to express personal opinions on any political or social issues, even in private conversations that might be overheard or reported. This meant that the passionate advocacy work she had begun to develop around mental health awareness, early childhood development, and women's rights had to be completely sanitized of any authentic emotion or personal conviction that might be construed as political commentary. Just last week, Catherine had been forced to withdraw a speech she had written for a charity event focused on domestic violence awareness. The speech had included her personal reflections on the courage she had witnessed in survivors she had met and her genuine anger at the systems that had failed to protect them. The palace's review committee had determined that her emotional language could be interpreted as criticism of government social services, making it inappropriate for a royal to deliver. Instead, she had been given a bland, statistics-heavy speech that conveyed none of the passion or authenticity that had motivated her involvement with the cause in the first place. Catherine stared at the rejected speech draft that lay on her desk, her own words looking foreign and dangerous to her now. She had written about meeting a young mother who had escaped an abusive relationship with her two small children, describing the woman's strength and determination in rebuilding her life. Catherine had wanted to honor that woman's story, to use her platform to amplify voices that were often silenced or ignored. Instead, she had been told that such personal anecdotes were too risky, too emotional, too likely to be misinterpreted as political statements. The memory of that conversation with the speech review committee still stung. She had been told, in carefully diplomatic language, that her role was to be a symbol of support rather than an advocate for change. The distinction felt meaningless to Catherine, who had always believed that true support required being willing to speak difficult truths and challenge systems that caused harm. Now, she was expected to smile prettily at charity events, shake hands, and deliver empty platitudes that offended no one and inspired no one. Even her interactions with the charitable organizations she supported had become increasingly scripted and artificial. Catherine was no longer permitted to have unmonitored conversations with charity workers or beneficiaries, meaning that every interaction had to be planned, rehearsed, and supervised. The spontaneous moments of connection that had once made her patronage work feel meaningful and authentic were now impossible. She remembered a visit to a children's hospital just 2 months ago, before this latest restriction had been implemented. Catherine had been talking with a young boy undergoing cancer treatment, and he had asked her a direct question about whether she ever got scared. In that moment, she had been able to answer honestly, sharing that everyone feels afraid sometimes, but that courage means doing important things even when we're scared. The conversation had been real, human, and exactly the kind of authentic connection that made her royal duties feel worthwhile. Now, such conversations would be impossible. Every interaction with the public had to be filtered through predetermined talking points and approved responses. Catherine would no longer be able to respond naturally to the people she met, to share genuine moments of empathy or understanding. She would be reduced to a walking, talking symbol who could offer nothing more substantial than a carefully crafted public relations message. The restrictions on her personal relationships had also intensified dramatically. Catherine had been informed that she was no longer permitted to maintain friendships with anyone who had ever expressed political opinions publicly, regardless of what those opinions were or how long she had known the person. This sweeping rule effectively ended several important friendships that had sustained her through the challenges of royal life. Her friend Emma, who had been her roommate at university and had stood by her through every stage of her relationship with William, was now off limits because she had once posted a message on social media supporting environmental protection policies. Another close friend, Rebecca, who had been Catherine's confidant and workout partner for years, was deemed inappropriate company because she had signed a petition supporting increased funding for mental health services. These women, who had been sources of stability and normalcy in Catherine's life, were now classified as security risks because they had committed the crime of having opinions about issues that mattered to them. Catherine felt the cruel irony that the very qualities that had drawn her to these friendships, their intelligence, their compassion, their engagement with the world around them, were now the reasons she was forbidden from seeing them. She was being systematically isolated from anyone who might challenge her to think critically or encourage her to maintain her own sense of identity outside of her royal role. The restrictions on her children's activities had also expanded in ways that broke Catherine's heart. George, Charlotte, and Louis were no longer permitted to participate in normal school activities that might put them in contact with children whose parents had not been thoroughly vetted. This meant no more birthday parties with classmates, no more spontaneous playdates, no more of the ordinary childhood experiences that Catherine had desperately wanted to preserve for them. She thought about George's disappointment when he had to miss his best friend's birthday party because the friend's father worked as a journalist for a regional newspaper. The 8-year-old couldn't understand why his father's job made him unsuitable company for a prince, and Catherine had struggled to explain restrictions that seemed arbitrary and cruel even to her adult understanding. She watched her son's confusion turn to resignation as he accepted that his friendships, like everything else in his life, would be subject to approval and oversight. Charlotte had been equally devastated when she was withdrawn from the school drama club because the teacher had once been involved in a peaceful protest about education funding. The little girl had been so excited about playing a tree in the school's production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and she had practiced her one line for weeks. When Catherine had to tell her daughter that she couldn't participate anymore, Charlotte had asked with heartbreaking innocence whether being a princess meant she wasn't allowed to be in plays. Catherine had no good answer to give her. The dining restrictions had become particularly absurd and painful. Catherine was no longer permitted to eat at restaurants that had not been pre-approved by security and protocol teams, which meant that the list of acceptable establishments was limited to about 6 high-end venues in London that catered specifically to the royal family and other VIPs. The casual cafes where she had once enjoyed quiet lunches with friends, the family restaurants where she had taken the children for pizza, and the ethnic food establishments that had helped her maintain some connection to the broader world were all now forbidden. Even eating at approved restaurants required so much advanced planning and security preparation that it barely resembled a normal dining experience. Every meal out became a production involving multiple security sweeps, predetermined seating arrangements, and carefully vetted staff. The simple pleasure of trying a new restaurant or grabbing an impromptu bite to eat had been completely eliminated from her life. Catherine's shopping privileges had been similarly curtailed. She was no longer allowed to browse stores casually or make purchases without advance approval for both security and protocol teams. Every shopping trip had to be planned like a military operation, with stores cleared of other customers and staff briefed on appropriate behavior. The joy she had once found in discovering new brands, supporting small businesses, or simply enjoying the tactile experience of shopping had been replaced by sterile, orchestrated events that felt more like photo opportunities than genuine retail experiences. The restrictions on her physical appearance had also intensified beyond anything she could have imagined. Catherine was now required to maintain the same hairstyle and color for months at a time to avoid speculation about her mental state or personal circumstances. Any significant change to her appearance required approval from a committee that analyzed the potential public reaction and media interpretation. Even small changes, like trying a new shade of lipstick or adjusting her eyebrow shape, had to be cleared in advance. Catherine touched her hair self-consciously as she remembered the consultation she had had with the style committee just last week. She had wanted to try a slightly shorter cut. Nothing dramatic, just a few inches to make her hair more manageable during the busy summer season ahead. Instead, she had been presented with a detailed analysis of how shorter hair might be interpreted as a sign of stress, rebellion, or unhappiness in her marriage. The committee had recommended that she maintain her current length for at least another year to avoid unwanted speculation. As she sat in her study, surrounded by the documentation of her shrinking world, Catherine tried to remember the last time she had made a truly spontaneous decision about anything. She couldn't recall a single moment in recent months when she had been able to act on impulse, follow her instincts, or simply do something because she wanted to do it. Every aspect of her existence had been planned, approved, and monitored by others who claimed to know better than she did what was appropriate for her own life. The weight of her isolation pressed down on her like a physical force. Catherine realized that she was becoming a stranger to herself, going through the motions of a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow and meaningless on the inside. She wondered if this was what the rest of her life would be like. An endless series of restrictions and prohibitions that slowly erased every trace of the woman she had once been, leaving behind only a carefully constructed facade that satisfied everyone except the person trapped inside it. The morning of Catherine's 40th birthday dawned gray and drizzly, perfectly matching the melancholy that had settled over her spirit like a heavy shroud. As she looked out at the rain-soaked gardens of Kensington Palace, Catherine couldn't help but think about how different this milestone felt from what she had once imagined. At 25, she had dreamed of turning 40 as a confident woman who had found her place in the world, surrounded by close friends and family, celebrating a life lived with purpose and authenticity. Instead, she felt like she was mourning the death of that imagined woman, grieving for dreams and possibilities that had been systematically eliminated over the years. The latest restrictions had arrived just 2 days before her birthday, as if the palace had decided to give her the cruelest possible gift. Catherine was now prohibited from expressing any personal grief or sadness in public, even in circumstances where such emotions would be entirely natural and human. The decision had been made following an incident the previous month when she had been photographed with tears in her eyes while visiting a memorial for children who had died in a tragic accident. The image of her genuine sorrow had been interpreted by some media outlets as a sign of mental instability or marital problems, leading to weeks of speculation and analysis that the palace found unacceptable. From now on, Catherine would be expected to maintain complete emotional composure at all times when in public view, regardless of the circumstances she encountered or the depth of feeling they evoked in her. Catherine thought about that memorial visit and the overwhelming sadness she had felt while meeting the families of those lost children. Her tears had been an honest response to their pain, a natural expression of empathy that had felt like the only appropriate reaction to such tragedy. Now, she was being told that even this most basic human response was inappropriate for someone in her position, that her genuine emotions were a liability that needed to be controlled and suppressed. The restriction felt particularly cruel because it effectively banned her from being authentically present during some of the most important and meaningful moments of her royal duties. How could she comfort grieving families if she wasn't allowed to show her own grief? How could she connect with people experiencing trauma or loss if she had to maintain an artificial facade of detachment? The very empathy that had made her effective in her charitable work was now being classified as a weakness that needed to be eliminated. William had tried to comfort her when the new rule was announced, holding her as she wept privately in their bedroom. "I know it seems impossible, darling," he had whispered into her hair, "but maybe we can find other ways for you to show you care. Perhaps your presence alone will be enough." But Catherine knew that presence without authenticity was just performance, and she was tired of performing her life instead of living it. The birthday celebration itself was a perfect example of how every aspect of her existence had become a carefully orchestrated public relations exercise. Instead of the intimate family gathering she had requested, Catherine was required to host a formal luncheon for representatives from her various patronages. Every guest had been selected by the palace communications team based on their potential to generate positive media coverage, and every detail of the event had been designed to project specific messages about her commitment to public service and her contentment in her role. Catherine had wanted nothing more than to spend her birthday quietly with William and the children, perhaps taking a long walk through the countryside or having a simple picnic in the garden. Instead, she would spend the day smiling for cameras, making small talk with strangers, and pretending that this orchestrated performance was exactly how she had hoped to mark this significant milestone. Even her birthday cake had been chosen by committee, designed to symbolize her various charitable interests rather than simply being something she might actually enjoy eating. The gift-giving restrictions had reached new levels of absurdity as well. Catherine was no longer permitted to accept personal gift from anyone outside the immediate royal family, meaning that the thoughtful presents from friends and extended family that had once brought her such joy were now forbidden. Even gifts for her children had to be screened and approved, with many items deemed inappropriate for various protocol reasons that seemed to have nothing to do with the children's happiness or well-being. Catherine's sister Pippa had wanted to give her a photo album filled with pictures from their childhood, candid images that captured their relationship and shared history. The gift had been rejected because some of the photos showed Catherine in casual, unguarded moments that were deemed inconsistent with her current public image. The idea that her own childhood memories could be considered inappropriate struck Catherine as the ultimate violation of her personal identity. The children's questions about their mother's restricted life had become increasingly difficult to answer. Charlotte, now 7 years old and remarkably perceptive, had asked why Mummy couldn't come to watch her school sports day like the other mothers. George had wondered why their family couldn't go on vacation to the beach resort that his friend's family had visited. Louis, still too young to understand the complexities of royal life, simply knew that there were always people watching and that many of his requests to spend time with Mummy alone were met with complicated explanations about schedules and safety. Catherine found herself struggling to explain restrictions that she herself barely understood or accepted. How could she teach her children to be authentic and true to themselves when she was being forced to abandon those very qualities? How could she encourage them to form meaningful friendships when her own relationships were being systematically dismantled? How could she model emotional honesty and empathy when she was forbidden from expressing her genuine feelings? The impact on her marriage had become increasingly evident as well. William, caught between his love for his wife and his duty to the institution he would one day lead, found himself in an impossible position. He could see Catherine's spirit being slowly crushed by the weight of restrictions and expectations, but he felt powerless to protect her without undermining the very system they were both sworn to serve. Their conversations had become strained and careful, both of them aware that even their private moments were subject to scrutiny and potential oversight. The easy intimacy they had once shared was being replaced by a formal politeness that protected them both from saying things that might be misinterpreted or reported. Catherine sometimes felt like she was losing not just herself, but also the relationship that had been the foundation of her strength throughout this transformation. The final restriction that had arrived with her birthday protocols was perhaps the most devastating of all. Catherine was now prohibited from ever being alone, even within the palace walls. A member of staff or security personnel would be assigned to accompany her at all times, officially for her protection, but effectively ensuring that she never had a moment of true privacy or solitude. The few precious hours she had once been able to steal for quiet reflection, for processing her emotions, or simply for being herself without performance or pretense, were now gone forever. Catherine thought about all the small rebellions she had already lost, the ability to take a spontaneous walk, to call a friend when she needed to talk, to cry when something moved her deeply, to express an opinion that came from her heart rather than from a committee's talking points. Now, even the rebellion of being alone with her thoughts was being taken away. She would be observed, monitored, and accompanied every moment of every day for the rest of her life. As she prepared for her birthday luncheon, Catherine looked at herself in the mirror one last time as a private individual. In a few minutes, she would go downstairs and begin another day of performance, another day of being the version of herself that had been approved and sanitized for public consumption. She wondered if anyone would notice that the woman they saw was just a carefully constructed shadow of the person she had once been. The woman in the mirror looked back at her with eyes that had learned to hide their sadness, with a smile that had been practiced until it appeared genuine, with a posture that projected confidence and contentment even when she felt neither. Catherine realized that the transformation was nearly complete. The spontaneous, authentic, imperfect woman who had fallen in love with a prince was almost entirely gone, replaced by a flawless public figure who existed only to serve the needs and expectations of others. As she walked toward the door to begin her birthday performance, Catherine made a silent promise to herself. Somewhere deep inside, in a place that no protocol could reach and no committee could govern, she would try to keep alive some small piece of the woman she had been. Even if no one else ever saw it again, even if she could only access it in the few seconds between sleep and waking, she would not let them take everything. In that hidden place, she would remain Catherine Middleton, the girl who had once believed that love could conquer anything, including the gilded cage that love had ultimately led her into. The door closed behind her as she left for her birthday celebration, and, with it, another chapter of her old life came to an end. But, in her heart, Catherine carried the hope that someday, somehow, there might be a way back to the authentic life she had lost, or perhaps forward to a new kind of authenticity that could exist within the constraints that now defined her world. Until then, she would continue to perform the role of the perfect princess, while quietly mourning the woman she had been and might never be allowed to be again.